Welcome back. My name is Hunter Francis, and I'm speaking to you today from Cal Poly State University in San Luis Obispo, California, where I direct the Center for Sustainability in the College of Agriculture. This is part 2 of our online educational series on soil health that's focusing on the role of soil biology in soil health and its assessment. Today we're going to look specifically at some of the actors in the biological system down under, what they do, and why they're so important. As we will see, there's quite a cast of characters in the soil. There's literally a zoo beneath our feet that involves all kingdoms of nature and myriad interactions among them. Anywhere you go on the planet, you will find a rich diversity of organisms that will vary according to the circumstance, but that will usually have at least some members of each main grouping represented. This carnival of characters includes both good and bad actors, but it's important to realize that the vast majority of them are helpful to us, and in the end make life on Earth possible. And there are certainly a lot of them. This graphic from the Atlas of Soil Biodiversity, which is listed on our resources page here, gives an estimation of some of the main groupings of organisms and how many of each may be contained in an average soil. Normally, in cultivated agricultural situations, it's the bacteria that outnumber everybody else, although their numbers can vary, especially in relationship to fungi, as we will see. What's especially important to note in this slide is how those numbers in aggregate might compare to animals that we'd be used to seeing on the surface, such as cows. This diagram is in metric, saying that you might expect to find about 20 cows worth of organisms under a healthy soil per hectare, which would translate to about 8 or 9 cows per acre, since there are a little over 2 acres in a hectare. Estimates can vary widely in terms of how representatives from some of the different kingdoms constitute an ecosystem. Perhaps this is because there is such a variety of natural habitats. The pie chart on the left here is a fairly recent estimation from the University of Arizona, which says that overall on the planet, the bacteria, in terms of numbers of species, likely far outnumber everybody else. What's interesting when you compare that to the pie chart on the right is that the slice of bacteria or microorganisms, here called Monera, which is their biological kingdom, is quite small in terms of the actual numbers of species that have been identified. In this case, insects win the prize for the most number of species that are known and identified. In fact, the insects make up a huge portion of the biomass on land, with biomass meaning the total weight of a group of organisms, and are therefore responsible for a very large percentage of terrestrial respiration. This chart, also from the Atlas of Biodiversity and somewhat more recent, claims that there are quite a few more species of bacteria that are actually known, and yet still in this case claims that less than 2% of them have been identified. Most microbiologists agree that we know less than 5% of who the actual microorganisms are. We know even less about the protists, which are the soil organisms that are larger than fungi and bacteria, such as protozoa, amoeba, algae, and so on, claiming here that less than 1% of them are known, and yet the possible number of their species is in the tens of millions. That compared with the number of plants on land being less than 500,000. Perhaps it's best that the census is vague and inconclusive on how many and who all these critters are. They clearly haven't been accorded appropriate recognition, and in fact most people utterly disrespect them and in many cases fear them. This is a mindset that will probably change as we know more about them and the vital roles that they play in the soil biome. This is certainly the case in medicine, that practically daily is learning more about the microbes within us and how important they are for our own personal health. In terms of how they can benefit agriculture, most people are aware that they are vital in helping to break down residues, releasing nutrients, and keeping the cycle of life moving forward, What's perhaps less realized is the fact that they're not only releasing nutrients, but they're also helping to hang on to them. Wherever there's food, they will grow, and this is good news in the case of nutrients that are easily leachable, such as nitrates. When microorganism populations are weak in a certain setting, nutrients that could otherwise be utilized are often lost. Beyond the root zone where plants are growing, many of the microbes, in particular the fungi, which have long mycelial networks, will help plants reach nutrients and make them available. We'll also see that they can help protect plant roots, both physically and in terms of the chemicals they release. In terms of nutrient cycling, as one person put it, the microbiome is the eye of the needle. Microbes always eat first, and a lot of the nutrition that ultimately ends up in plants makes its way first through the microbial world. The improvement of soil structure is a key contribution of the soil microbial world. Through the intermingling of their bodies and their excretions, they help hold different pieces of the soil to create a complex of aggregates, here depicted from macro to micro aggregates, with predictions about what types of organisms you might find in each habitat. More and more, science is examining and elucidating how exactly this happens. In the case of helping to provide soils with more structure, the many gums, slimes, mucilages, and all kinds of carbon-containing biofilms that they secrete have a very important influence on binding soil mineral particles together. The protein glomalin is one such substance exuded from fungi, Mycorrhizae to be specific, that has received a lot of attention recently. Here it is shown coating soil particles and illuminated with a green fluorescence. Part of the reason that this particular substance may be such an effective glue is that it is fairly resistant to degradation. This makes it a relatively stable form of carbon. As mentioned, more and more is being known about how the bacteria in our gut are responsible for much of our nutrition and life processes. Many people refer to the microbiome in the soil as the gut of the plant, so to speak, because it provides a similar role for them, solubilizing, holding, and releasing nutrients. They say that about a half of our body weight is constituted by microbes. This is something that will certainly be explored more in the future. And in the soil, one thing to keep in mind is that the habitat for these very tiny creatures is exceedingly minute. Over 100,000 bacteria can fit on the head of a pin. Organic matter particles and colloidal mineral pieces create the architecture in soil that provide very tiny spaces for relatively huge amounts of organisms to squeeze into. What this means is that in very short distances, sometimes just a matter of centimeters or fractions of an inch, microbial communities can vary greatly. These factors all go into determining what types of organisms you may find in a soil niche. Temperature and moisture, which are obviously related to climate, play a big role, but so do food sources, types of vegetation, and sometimes management practices. On a larger scale, this also creates different zones in the underground world. Typically, you will find a big difference between the rhizosphere, which is the area around plant roots, versus what is referred to as bulk soil, which is further removed from the reach of plants. Microbial populations are normally much greater in the rhizosphere, where food is plentiful, than in other areas of the soil farther away from roots. This chart from a well-known soil scientist shows how different types of microorganisms vary depending on the depth of the soil. Algae, which live by fixing carbon from the air through photosynthesis via sunlight, are obviously found near the surface of the soil. The bacteria and the fungi, being the smallest, can be found several feet down, with some of the larger microorganisms being in the middle. A key determinant of who's there is oxygen. This potentially has some serious ramifications for agriculture. A lot of the beneficial bacteria and other microorganisms that are so vital to plant health are aerobic, meaning they live in the presence of oxygen. As it turns out, some notable bad actors can live without oxygen. Here on the left is a picture of Salmonella with E. coli on the right. They are both what are called facultative anaerobes, meaning they prefer an aerobic environment, but when deprived of oxygen, they are able to survive. This means, in waterlogged situations, that they have a competitive advantage over many of the beneficial microorganisms that need air to live. When it comes down to categorizing who exactly is there, biologists can use a number of different ways to classify groupings of soil organisms. Often they will base classifications on the taxonomy or the biological families of organisms. Increasingly, we are using genetics to classify organisms, but they might also be grouped by their morphology or their sizes and shapes, where they like to live, or even their functions and byproducts. The easiest way to group basic categories, which we just mentioned, is by size. Macrofauna refer to the larger organisms that we can easily see, like earthworms or centipedes. The mesofauna are somewhat in between, things like earwigs or rotifers. Microfauna, in this case, are organisms that are larger than the bacterial and fungal microorganisms, but still difficult to see with the naked eye, such as nematodes. Biologists often refer to the very large soil organisms, such as moles or gophers, as megafauna. In terms of the roles, they can be classified by some basic functions. This chart shows groupings of organisms based on their food sources. One thing to note here is the grazers in the middle of the chart. These are the bacterial and fungal feeders. They're often microfauna, like protozoans, and they help keep microorganism populations in check. These grazers also play a role in the mineralization of nutrients, which is important to agriculture, because they eat and digest things like bacteria and fungi, thus spilling out their nutrients into the soil system. For this reason, they're sometimes called the unzippers. This next chart is somewhat simpler, grouping categories of some of the main biological organisms in terms of who's doing what from an ecosystem perspective. All of these functions provided by the microbiome are vital to agriculture. I'd like now to take a closer look of some of who these players are. We'll start with the bacteria, which are the smallest microorganisms and often the most numerous in agriculture in terms of numbers. Bacteria are the simplest of microorganisms, being single-cellular, and they are distinguished by the fact that they have no true nucleus, making them what is called prokaryote. These guys are sometimes referred to as the chemical engineers because through their life activities, they are able to degrade and make food out of a very wide range of substrates. As a matter of fact, they'll eat pretty much anything you feed them. There's actually a whole new science of bioremediation, sometimes involving genetic engineering, that is being used to help degrade some very problematic and toxic substances. Bacteria are known to be ubiquitous, which means they are ever present and always on hand, ready to do work. When the food is there, they have an amazing way of showing up, perhaps like unwanted relatives, but usually welcome ones. There are many bacteria that we could point to. One of the most commonly known are the rhizobia, which are in symbiosis with plant roots. These organisms have the remarkable ability of breaking the very long or strong bond in nitrogen that's found in the atmosphere as the most common element actually, but that is unavailable to plants in the form that it's found in the air. These organisms occupy the roots of legumes and create nodules within the roots, which become their nitrogen-producing factories. It was explained to me that those factories are working well when the nodules have a nice pink interior. The beautiful fungi have a special fascination for many. A soil microbiologist professor of mine used to say they're fun guys, and they're part of the ubiquitous crowd. They also have their own unique beauty and can be found above ground by their fruiting bodies, which we are most familiar with, although the bulk of the mass of these larger fungal organisms are under the surface of the earth in their root-like structures. The fungi can be either single-cellular, like a bacterium, or more often multicellular, forming large networks. Unlike the bacteria, they do have a true nucleus and are therefore called eukaryotic. EU is the Greek word for good. They have a good nucleus. They're also known for being microorganisms that are especially good at breaking down compounds that are otherwise resistant to microbial degradation, such as lignin and woody materials. Like the bacterial microbes, they are doing a lot of the digestion outside of their bodies, which is helping not only themselves, but plants and other organisms in the soil. Yeast, which are single-cellular fungi, and known well by brewers and winemakers, are often neglected when people think about the beneficial roles of fungi in soil, but they are increasingly being recognized for their role in helping to preserve and break down nutrients. They're somewhat larger than bacteria, over 10 times the size, and can form extensive colonies underground, which can help shuttle nutrients across the soil system. The larger multicellular fungi are particularly noted for this through their mycelial networks that are made up of root-like hyphae and can extend for long distances. A special class of fungi, and ones that are increasingly being used as a bioamendment or an inoculum in agricultural soils, are the Mycorrhizae. The word Mycorrhizae comes from the Greek words myco, which means fungi, and rhiza, which means root. They are in a mutualistic relationship with the plant root, benefiting from food introduced into the rhizosphere by the root, and in return helping to bring nutrients back to the plant. In these photos, it's very easy to see how incredibly important the mycorrhizae can be in helping the plant roots to extend their reach throughout the soil system, often extending that reach many-fold. Mycorrhizae are vital to many plants. As a matter of fact, over 80% of terrestrial plants are in some sort of relationship with mycorrhizae. There are essentially two types of mycorrhizae: endomycorrhizae, which actually penetrate into the cells of the root itself, and ecto, or outer mycorrhizae, which surround the surface of the root and penetrate the outer skin of the root, but not into the cells themselves. The endomycorrhizae are now usually called AMF, or arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, because they will form arbuscules, which are net-like structures that penetrate into the root cells. Sometimes these fungi have vesicles, which are bladder-like structures that also can make their way into cell roots. Vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizae, or VAM, are a subset of endomycorrhizae that have vesicles. All vesicular mycorrhizal fungi are arbuscular, but not all endomycorrhizae are vesicular. Ectomycorrhizal fungi are often found in trees and are important in the tree nursery industry to get species like pines going, and they can play an important role not just in nutrition, but can offer significant protection to plant roots, being able to cover well over 3/4 of the root surface as a kind of shield. A more precise look at these two types of mycorrhizae show that the ecto, or outer mycorrhizae, can actually penetrate the epidermis of the plant root and get in between cells, but do not penetrate the cells themselves within the plant, as do the endomycorrhizae, or the arbuscular mycorrhizae. Here you can see the bladder-like vesicles, which serve as storage for some of the arbuscular mycorrhizae, the vesicular mycorrhizae, and the finger-like arbuscules, which are in all endomycorrhizae. We won't spend much time on the larger creatures, but they can be both considerable friend and foe. By chopping up larger substances, they often serve the role as food processor in the organic matter disassembly line that help make plant and animal residues more available to smaller microorganisms. Through their burrowing in the soil, they are also known as mixers, helping to bring residue down into the soil profile and bringing nutrients that have been leached down back up into the higher regions. For all the trouble they can create, gophers and organisms like them do a wonderful job of tilling the soil. But even smaller organisms, like the lowly earthworm, have a fundamental role in passing residues through their rich gut environments, a biome in itself. And we shouldn't forget that plants are soil organisms too, and in a sense their presence is vital for the microbial community, because it is often through plants that easily assimilable carbon sources are brought into the soil system. It is said that as much as half, or even more, of the carbohydrates that a plant produces are exuded through its roots in the form of what are called exudates. These are a vital nutritional source for the microbes. And this expenditure of energy tells us that the plants value the microorganisms that they're feeding, and it's because they get something back. Namely, they are getting solubilized nutrients from the soil, antibiotics, protection, water, and nutrients. And one of the interesting things that scientists are telling us is that this interaction is not willy-nilly. Through molecular signaling, plants have the ability to alert microorganisms as to what they need, and vice versa. There's a communication that's happening through the exudates that's being understood more and more. All these interactions, particularly in regards to the consumption and breakdown of food sources, are referred to as trophic interactions. Troph is a Greek word for food or eating, I believe. And these create a web of life, sometimes referred to as the soil food web. This well-known picture shows that the food chain is not really a linear pipeline. There are all kinds of back and forth interactions that create an intricate network of life. This picture is from the Soil Biology Primer, which was put together by Elaine Ingham and other scientists in the late 90s. It's made available through NRCS, through the link on this web page, and it's still a useful resource. One of the things that Dr. Ingham often refers to in this trophic web as being important, and which is receiving a fair amount of attention, is the relative makeup of some of the key microorganisms within the soil food web. In particular, the relationship of the bacteria to the fungi. Briefly, the theory is that this ratio is related to biological succession, with bacteria being heavily dominant on the left side of this chart, and the fungi predominating in the more highly evolved ecological communities, such as forests. In between, you have things like shrubs, vines, and deciduous trees. This may have ramifications for agriculture, because the theory is that different types of plants prefer a different type of fungal to bacteria ratio. Just how important it is to have a certain type of plant in soil with the correct fungal bacteria ratio is debated. However, it is commonly agreed that when soil is cultivated or otherwise disturbed, bacteria will dominate. This makes sense for several reasons. One is that many of the multicellular fungi are sensitive to and will be disrupted by disturbance. Those organisms also tend to thrive where woodier food sources are present, like in the forests. In any case, the fungal-bacteria ratio will fluctuate for a variety of reasons, such as those talked about in Chapter 1, environmental factors like oxygen, food source, and so forth. But they will also be influenced by management. This is a list of some of the main ways that this fungal-bacteria ratio may be influenced, including the idea of where a plant community is in terms of its biological succession, but also where the community stands temporally in terms of season. It makes sense that with rapidly growing plants in the spring that are exudating lots of simple sugars and carbohydrates, more easily decomposable substances, the bacteria are going to thrive. Whereas in the fall, when normally there is an abundance of more complex and woody type material that is present and has fallen to the ground, the fungi are going to benefit. So, as has been mentioned, the environments and the microbes that are created by things like management and food sources will influence who is in the microbial community. This chart reflects that fact and depicts how common tillage practices, either quote-unquote conventional or no-till, impact the biotic communities underground. What's most noticeable here is that the fungi are represented in a much larger proportion when they are not disturbed by tillage. Whereas in the cultivated system, the bacterial populations outnumber the fungi on the right. Other things to notice are the arthropods, which are some of the choppers of plant residues and leftovers, likewise do better when they are not disturbed, as do some of the larger organisms like the earthworms. We're now coming into a time where a whole new range of products are being used to help support the microbiome in agriculture. As a group, these are often referred to as biostimulants, and we will be covering them in much more detail in a later version of this series. It's a very exciting and growing industry that includes both food sources and organisms themselves that can be introduced into agriculture to help bolster healthy soil activity. I've had the opportunity to attend several lectures on the effectiveness of biostimulants. And one of the interesting things that has been found in their study is that they are particularly effective in helping to preserve yields and plant growth when a stressor is involved, such as an abiotic stressor like drought. It's almost as if they're serving the role as a good vitamin or a healthy diet that help keep us healthy in normal times and may not be that noticed, but may make all the difference when flu season starts and plants are having to withstand extra pressures. So these are something to look for more and more, and as I said, we'll be explaining them later on in a future series. So the bottom line here is it's good to take care of the microbiome. And while you're feeding the plant, always remember that you're feeding the soil and a lot of the beneficial activities that happen there.